level, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the first thing that you read in the book. June 9th, 2014. To BayRidgeMama475 at gmail.com from AlexIsFire475 at gmail.com. Mother, I am sorry for what I have to tell you. Maybe if I was more brave, I would say it to your face. But by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I realize this will be a shock. You know me only as the quiet, obedient son you and Dad raised me to be. You dressed me and fed me only too well. You sent me to the best schools. You mainly spoke English to me at home so that I barely learned any Arabic. You helped me with my homework. You tolerated the rap and the heavy metal, the mess in my room, paid for my PS4 and the Sony camcorder. You helped me take the tests and fill out the applications to the colleges you assumed I would attend. And I know you hoped I would become a big American success story and make you proud, like Dad with his office at Chase Bank, or Grandpa with his gas station and his Cadillac Escalade. I am sorry I am going to disappoint you. But the curtain has been thrown back. The dream is over. What happened to Dad last summer woke me up. Yes, I know the FBI agents who arrested him and held him overnight at the jail have officially apologized for mistaking him for a terrorist with the same name. And I know that you and Dad are ready to accept this and move on. But I can't. I now see how easily everything we have can be taken away. All our savings, Dad's customer relations job, the gas pumps Grandpa owns, the big house on Colonial Road. All our assets could have been frozen, our cash spent on defense lawyers. That American flag we fly on our front porch and the little U.S. Constitutions Grandpa likes to give our guests, they're jokes. We never really belonged here. I've known it for as long as I can remember. In fact, my earliest memory is being at the playground with you after those towers came down and having the other kids call me Osama and tell me to go back to the desert. I remember how you tried to comfort me that day. You told me to dry my tears and hold my head up, that we were as American as anyone else. But we both know that was a lie. These people never wanted us here, and they have no business in the place where we come from. The world is what it is, a battlefield. And we must all choose sides. We must fight to be free men and women or live and die as slaves and prisoners. I choose to fight. So I won't be going off to Cornell to study chemistry and video production this fall. I'll be learning more valuable lessons on the battlefront where, God willing, we will find victory or glory in martyrdom. My life is meaningless without struggle. How could I stand in line buying sweatshirts at the college bookstore or tossing a frisbee across the quad when other men my age are risking body and soul to confront the enemy? How can I sit in lecture halls, taking notes and grubbing for grades when I know my brothers are marching through deserts and valleys with AK-47s slung over their shoulders? How can I hang out on social media or go to the library trying to meet girls or be in a dorm with my roommate playing Grand Theft Auto 5 when other boys my age are on a hilltop with the true power of life and death in their trigger fingers? Even as I write this, I find myself imagining your reaction. After the shock subsides, I know there will be tears. And disbelief, too. You will ask yourself what went wrong, what you could have done differently. You'll ask if you should have sent me to a psychiatrist when I started fighting with you and Dad all the time. You'll imagine there are friendships you could have encouraged, or perhaps discouraged. You'll think I shouldn't have spent so much time alone, in front of screens, getting radicalized. And while it's true, I've spent a lot of time watching martyr videos and talking to my recruiters about joining the struggle, it's also irrelevant. This journey has always been my destiny. The soul of a warrior has always been within me, even when my only weapon was the shovel in the sandbox or the joystick I held playing Call of Duty. I know that the course I've chosen must make no sense to you, but the material life of the present is not enough for me. Something further back in the past is calling out, telling me those other kids were right. I should go back to the desert. Please don't grieve. I will always keep you, Dad, Amy, Samantha, and Grandpa in my heart. God willing, we will be together again in a better place someday. Please tell Amy and Samantha to stay out of my room, except to feed the fish. No one wants his little sisters nosing around. Feel free to put all my video games and DVDs out on the sidewalk, though I seriously doubt anyone will want them, because most are really old. And try not to be too sad or scared. I know I've never traveled anywhere farther than New Jersey on my own, but I'm totally doing what I need to do. Your son, Abu Soror. I looked it up. It means father of joy. P.S. I don't want to be called Alex anymore. July 23rd, 2014. To alexsfire475@gmail.com from Grandpa Ali 71@AOL.com. Dear Alex, I'm too old to call you by any other name. I do not use the email very often, but there seems to be no other way to reach you. Your mother tells me your cell phone is turned off and you have left no forwarding address for regular mail. Whether this message will ever reach you or whether you will respond in any way, I have no idea. I pray you are still alive to read this. It has been more than 6 weeks since any of us heard from you. Your mother cries every single day, often several times in the course of one meal. Occasionally your two sisters cry as well, but mostly they just stay in their rooms. Your father is like a zombie. Since you haven't answered any of your parents' emails, I don't know if you're aware that he left his job at the bank to devote himself full-time to searching for you. He has spoken to every taxi service, every airline, every State Department and embassy official who will take his calls. He flew to Cairo and Istanbul, showing your picture and spending thousands of dollars on fixers trying to track you down. It appears you slipped through the fence to Syria to join these so-called militants fighting under the black flag. When your father tried to follow your path, he was detained by the Syrian police, badly beaten, and sent back to Turkey. Now he is home, and though your mother says she doesn't blame him for not finding you, they are not happy in the way they used to be, which makes me very sad. There is no real reason for you to respond to me when you haven't responded to anyone else. Even though I've been part of your life since the moment you were born, you hardly know me. And I'm sure you would say I hardly know you, even though we've lived under the same roof since your grandmother died and your parents asked me to move in so they could keep an eye on me. You are a young man who says he is off to fight a battle for his people. I am an old man who owns a gas station with a convenience store in Bay Ridge, prays 5 times a day, roots for the New York Mets, misses his wife terribly, and cries at old movies. You have always played the dutiful, polite grandson around me. You have smiled at my tiresome jokes, pulled out the chair for me at the dinner table, and covered me with a blanket when I fall asleep snoring in front of the TV. You have shown me respect as the family elder, the father of your father, still working at the age of 85. And you have always been patient and said the right things. But I know you have not been very much interested in me. And why should you be? Someone who has lived what seems to you such a dull, complacent life could understand nothing about the great heroic journey you have embarked upon. Except one thing you said in your letter to your mother caught my attention. You say this journey you have embarked upon is your destiny. You believe that something far back in the past, beyond your parents' comfortable lives, is calling out. I understand this better than you realize. When I was your age, I went on a similar journey and very nearly did not come back. It's a story I've never told you. In fact, I've told very little of it to anyone in the United States since I came here more than 40 years ago. Even your father, my only child, knows just the broad outlines because I've always cut him off from asking too many questions. I wanted him to be an American, bright-eyed and hopeful, proud of me as his father, and knowing as little as possible about the past. Because the truth is that your boring grandfather, Ali Hassan, the gas station owner with his leathery skin, his old man cologne, and his corny jokes, spent many years in prison for being a violent criminal and lost his left eye in the process. I've always been strict about keeping this secret. But after your grandmother died, I found myself starting to write things down. Why? I wasn't sure at first. But when I was a young man, I was a kind of writer, or at least I aspired to be. So I began to write my life story, not because I believed anyone would ever publish it, but because I recognized something of my own restlessness in you. I wanted you to know me, to know that I had had this life so there would be some record to pass on. For a while, I thought I might not show it to you, at least not while I was still alive. But now, I feel more urgency to share it. I don't know if you will have the time or the inclination to read what I have attached here if God sees fit to have it reach you. But I hope you will, because I know how this movie ends. Yours, in love and compassion, Grandpa. In Ali, in Arabic, Guido. But I prefer for you to call me what you always have. So that's the beginning of the book. And just very briefly, what happens from there is it turns into a book within a book, and it tells the story of what happened to Ali, the grandfather, in the fall of 1954, when the most extravagant Bible epic in Hollywood history came to Egypt in the immediate aftermath of a revolution, and Ali got his dream job working as the assistant to Cecil B. DeMille on the Ten Commandments. And then it turns into a journey of love and loss that takes Ali from the movie set with Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner to a real-life assassination plot that changed the course of Middle Eastern history, to prison, and then finally a chance for redemption. It's also about a moment in history when the United States and the Middle East had a kind of love affair that ended badly, and how that moment still echoes into the world that we're living in today. But most importantly, it's a dialogue between past and present, between the grandfather and the grandson, who wants to understand that past and wants to understand how Ali became the man that he is. More importantly, how he, the grandson, might become the man he aspires to be himself. So anyway, we can talk about some of that.
That generational story between the grandfather Ali and Alex.
Yes.
Or I just found that the most fascinating part of reading the book. It's the central point of reading the book. And, you know, if you can expand a little bit about that relationship and about how you wrote that relationship.
That was actually the last part of the book to come together. I've been working on this book since 2002, since shortly after 9/11. And I knew I wanted to write a book about this extraordinary moment in 1954 when Egypt was in a state of turmoil because the king had just been deposed.
Mm-hmm.
Nasser had just come in as the military leader running the country. The Muslim Brotherhood wanted to turn the country into a theocracy, essentially the same conflict that is going on to this very day. And into the midst of that came Cecil B. DeMille, mounting this incredibly opulent Hollywood production with a cast of thousands, literally, and convincing the Egyptians to give him 200 cavalry officers to play the Pharaoh's soldiers, 20 Air Force planes to be the wind machines in the desert, and access to the pyramids and all the rest of the historic sites. Well, what I've learned in making the transition from being a journalist to being a novelist, interesting material is not necessarily a compelling emotional story. So for a long time, I struggled to figure out who's telling the story and why should people who don't remember Nasser, who don't remember Cecil B. DeMille, who don't necessarily care about 1954 and don't necessarily want to learn about that history, why should they care? So it always has to be a human story. I'm not a historical writer in any way. I'm not an expert on Egyptology or anything like that. All I know about is the emotional life of my characters. So at a certain point in the 20 years, I committed to making Ali the main character in the book. There's lots of American characters in the book. There's some real life people like Charlton Heston in the book. There's a woman he's in love with who's French Egyptian in the book. But I said that's going to be the main character in the book. But I still hadn't answered the most important question, which is why should people today care about this story from back then? And then I began thinking about these young people who turn their back on the West, who leave England, France, in some cases the United States, and go off to join what they perceive as a great struggle, a holy war. And I thought, oh, that would be an interesting dialogue between the older man who's had that experience in 1954 and a younger man who's had that experience, much more interesting. And also make it a dialogue about the old media of Hollywood, the classic era, 1954, and a young man who represents, you know, the generation that came of age with social media and video games and everything like that. And I thought that back and forth would give the book a kind of tension and emotion as well.
Well, I think it really, their relationship actually makes the historical parts matter, though.
Yeah.
And I think you did a wonderful job in doing that. You know, I had read somewhere that it took you, like you had mentioned, 20 years to write this book.
Yeah.
You took 5-6 trips to Egypt?
Yes. So I was there for a month during the revolution of the Arab Spring, and then sometimes for shorter periods. I was interviewing anybody who I could find who had been alive in 1954, who had been part of that struggle. I talked to Gamal al-Banna, who is the brother of the guy who founded the Muslim Brotherhood. I talked to people who had been in Nasser's government. I talked to Naguib Mahfouz shortly before he died, the Nobel novelist of Egypt. And then I also came out here and talked to everybody who was still alive, who had been involved in the Ten Commandments production. Henry James, I think, said, it is impossible to recreate the language and customs of a culture more than 50 years after it has ended. So I started writing the book in 2002, so I just got the tail end of that, literally. It was 48 years after the events I was writing about.
You're writing about a time period of 60 years.
Yes.
I mean, from 1954 to 2014.
Yes,
correct?
yes. Which is something I'd never done before.
Yeah,
Most
because-
of my other novels are urban contemporary novels. So this was part of the reason why it took 20 years, was that I just had to come up with a completely different way of telling stories than what I was used to.
Because you usually write contained, like with Law and Order, Law and Order, it's just a short period of time. How were you able to draw it out, but also condense it into something that's very ingestible and very entertaining, into something so small? Because this is such a wide scope of not only time, but you're dealing with historical aspects, you're doing with movie aspects, you're doing familiar aspects. It's really hard to do as a writer. It's really hard to do.
Well, I thought it was going to be one of those big, 600-page books because it takes on so many different things, but it just wouldn't keep the fat on its ass. I mean, it kept wanting to be a more direct story, and it wanted to be more of an emotional story. And every time I tried to include interesting material, I realized, you got to kill your darlings. It's interesting, but it's not moving the story forward. It's not deepening our understanding of the characters. It's not hooking you in emotionally. It just has to be a good story that you tell somebody late at night in the bar if they're drunk enough to listen to you, and stay out of the novel at that point. And the other thing that you asked about before was why I came up with the grandfather-grandson format. There's writing for the television shows, and that's a very, very regimented format. When I write the crime novels, usually I try and actually have the experience that the characters are having. So when I wrote my first novel, Slow Motion Riot, it's about a probation officer. And so I actually became a probation officer for 6 months so I could have the experience of doing it. And then I wrote a book called The Intruder, which is about a homeless guy stalking a family on the Upper West Side who he believes has stolen his life. So I worked at a homeless shelter for a year and went to the train tunnels where homeless people lived underneath them. During the pandemic, I couldn't do that kind of firsthand research. And I've been working on this book for so long, and it had run aground. And basically, it had been rejected, and by any rational means, it had reached the end of the line. People said, don't do it. You're done. It was a fool's errand. It's done. And it was in a different format. It had a different lead character who's not in the book at all anymore. It didn't have the format of the grandfather and the grandson. There were other things that were different, but it was dead and buried. And then during the pandemic, I thought to myself, I don't want to accept defeat. I believed in this story for so long. I have to believe there's something underneath here that's really worth getting to. And I don't want to quit. Just deep in my heart, I don't want to quit. And I'm going to finish this book and make it happen, even if I have to publish it myself. And even if only 6 people read it, I don't care. I need to see this journey through to the end. And my publisher, St. Martin's Minotaur, has published my crime novels. And I said to them, I have something that's completely different from anything that we've been doing. Are you willing to take a look at it? I said, okay. And long story short, they were the ones who were willing to make the leap and actually bring it out into the world. But that was only just like 2 years ago that happened. Yeah.
Was there a point that you realized that when you were on the right track,
Yeah.
and you knew when things were working out, did something happen in the story itself, or did something external occur?
I think I wrote the section that I just read
Yeah.
with the son leaving the letter to his mother. And I thought, like, my God, any parent receiving a letter like that would be heartbroken. I mean, I couldn't imagine wanting to turn away from finishing the story once that was on the page. I needed to know what happened to that kid, and I needed to know what would happen to the grandfather who reached out to him under this terrible circumstance, and whether he actually was able to have an effect on the child with this cautionary tale that he's sharing.
It's interesting. I'm not giving anything away by saying they lived parallel lives.
Yes.
The grandfather and
Yes,
grandson.
the story goes back and forth. Most of it takes place in 1954, the book within the book, but every few chapters, the grandson, it's almost like metafiction, says, who is this Charlton Heston that you're talking about? But what is this movie? And how could you have, like, participated in this blasphemy, this story about, Moses and the women and the, all this stuff. So that kind of began to make sense to me.
Speaking of the Ten Commandments, you had briefly mentioned, indirectly gave a shout out to Santa Barbara, by the way.
Yes.
By saying the first Ten Commandments, 1923, I think it was filmed up in Guadalupe and buried under sand, and that's why DeMille was he went over to Egypt to make this. But you yourself were somehow connected to the second movie, The Ten Commandments.
It had been around since my childhood. For as long as I remember, it was shown on the Easter Passover holiday. I don't think it's still, but it was ABC would show it every year. And part of the Passover ritual for me is, you have the manna shepherd's wine and the 4 questions, and you hide the matzah, and then the meal ends. And my personal ritual is I get up and go into another room and see if there's a game on. And if there's not a game on, I usually flip to Channel 7, and I usually ended up watching just the parting of the Red Sea sequence at the end of the Ten Commandments, which is really, for 1956, quite a remarkable sequence. Most of it was shot here on the Paramount lot.
Yeah.
But it also has pieces of film that were taken from other places. It's 7 different pieces of film. But I had never seen the movie from the beginning. In 2002, right after 9/11, everybody sort of had the heebie-jeebies, and so we didn't sit down to dinner right away. And I watched the film from the beginning for the very first time. And the credits roll, and there's Charlton Heston, there's Yul Brynner, there's Yvonne DiCarlo, and Baxter, and then it says, as the Pharaoh's army, the Egyptian Cavalry Corps. And that's when the light bulb went off, because I knew 1954 in Egypt was this crucial time in the clash of cultures. I knew this because I'd been a journalist, and also my wife, Peg Tyre, was one of the authors of a book about the first World Trade Center bombing. And we had met some of the terrorists who were involved in that, and I knew that period was very fraught. Well, I knew the movie had come out in 1956. I knew it was a very elaborate production, so I realized Cecil B. DeMille must have been in the country while this turmoil was going on and had somehow made a deal. While the Muslim Brotherhood was saying, like, we got to eradicate Western influences. And I said, if I can't get a book out of that, I'm in the wrong business. And I thought it would be a cinch, and then it took 20 years. So that was really the genesis of the project.
Because of your culture and 9/11, how deeply affected Jewish people in New York.
Yeah.
this connection that you've seen this movie, is it something that you felt spiritually that you had to see?
Well, there's something about the story of Moses that's just incredibly compelling to people. It's been a hit for 2,500 years, at least. I mean, it was in the Old Testament. It's referred to in the New Testament. Moses is a big figure in the Quran.
Mm-hmm.
He was Freud spent the last 20 years of his life writing a book about Moses. Obviously, Martin Luther King cited Moses.
Mm-hmm.
Herman Wouk, I believe, spent the last years of his life writing a book about Moses. So there's just something about it that speaks to people. Somebody was telling me a story the other night that she remembered seeing the Ten Commandments when it opened in 1956. And she went with her family's housekeeper, who was a black woman in Evanston, Illinois. And they went to the local movie theater, which was one of the theaters where black people were welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment when Moses said, "Let my people go," this woman who worked for the family jumped up and said, "Go Moses," and the whole theater erupted. Yeah, go Moses, go Moses. So it still speaks to people in some very deep way. But the other thing that always really moved me about it was the idea of Moses being this old man, keeping himself upright as he stood on top of the mountain just long enough so he could give his people the news and see the promised land. And that really I found compelling. And something similar happened to Cecil B. DeMille, because at the ultimate moment of the movie, the most important shot of his career in Egypt, when he was standing atop the gates of Ramses, which were 11 stories tall, and he was directing 15,000 extras and 15,000 animals in the Exodus scene, he had a near fatal heart attack.
Yeah.
And somehow finished the picture anyway, that this is in the novel. So it seemed fitting to put the novel in the voice of an old man trying to stay upright
Yeah.
and endure long enough to share this cautionary tale with his grandson as well. So that, and I just didn't think I would be that much freaking older myself by the time the book was published, but that's the way it goes sometimes.
A couple more questions and I'll turn it over to the audience. In terms of the movie itself, or the book itself, I should say, you interwove actual historical figures, not only DeMille, but Nasir, Naquib,
Yeah,
the would-be assassin
Yeah.
on Nasir's life.
yeah.
How were you able to do that without doing a Tarantino, so to speak, altering history or
no, I
changing
didn't.
history?
No, I mean, there's a couple of things that happen in the book that aren't strictly history, and I try and make
Okay.
it clear in the author's note at the end
Mhm.
what's real and what's embroidered.
But you don't change history, though.
No, not really, not really, except for certain elements. But I do find the real thing gives you lines of dialogue that you could have never had the nerve to make up yourself. So I did a lot of research for this book, as I mentioned. I mean, one of the most valuable resources were the grandchildren of Cecil B. DeMille, who were actually present in Egypt at the time. Cecilia Presley DeMille was 17, and she was there, and his grandson, Joe, was there as well. So they gave me a certain amount of material. And then fortunately, because the studio kept a lot of written material around, a lot of it I could just look up and read. There's a line of dialogue in the book where DeMille and Charlton Heston are on Mount Sinai with Ali, the hero of the book. And they're arguing back and forth about how the voice of God should be represented in the movie. And Heston says, "I have an idea. I think I should be the voice of God, speaking to me, playing Moses." And DeMille said, "You've already got a pretty good part in this movie." I couldn't have made that up. So you're not really just transcribing history, but it certainly gives you a higher platform to jump off when you know what the real deal was in that case.
Was that a challenge for you to write, though, as far as interweaving the story and without while keeping the historical aspects.
Well,
relatively curious.
that was part of the reason why it took 20 years, and part of the reason why it was so
Okay.
important to anchor it in the point of view of a character that was from my imagination.
Yeah.
Because, again, I'm not giving some objective overview of what was happening in Egypt at the time. I'm just giving you this little guy's point of view of what it looked like to him. There's a cliche in New York journalism. Look for the gravedigger, and it comes from something that the newspaper columnist Jimmy Breslin did. When Kennedy was assassinated, everybody else was writing about the grassy knoll and Jack Ruby and how many assassins there were. And Breslin went to the cemetery, and he found the guy who was actually digging the grave. And he wrote a column about him. And he made the whole thing come alive and feel vivid and moving in a completely new way. So I always look for the gravedigger, because that humanizes these big historic events in a way that, you know, at least I can relate to.
One last thing that I noticed is your ability to write the detail without overshowing
Yeah.
to the reader, like little things like Yul Brynner with cigarettes. As most people who are of age would know, that Yul Brynner died mostly because he smoked too many cigarettes
Yeah.
of lung cancer. Which is ironic. I told you about my uncle being in the King and I with Yul Brynner.
Yeah.
He had emphysema, and that's. But anyway, it was such a hard project for you, and I'm just wondering. My last question is: now that it's done, are you relieved? Are you happy?
I am relieved, and I am happy, because it's not about being a big bestseller. It's not about, you know, having a reputation. It's about having people read the book and then let me know that it landed for them in some way, because that's the difference between writing for television, writing for film, or writing even for theater. I'm sharing what's up here directly with the theater in somebody's mind, and already I've heard from people who've reached out to me personally, who let me know that they got it, and that's the reward. And I know that sounds corny, but I really mean it. That's that, because listen, I really didn't make money writing this book after 20 years.
Yeah,
I didn't. So, and I've been lucky enough to make a good living doing other things. So it's not what was me, but this was really something that I wanted to share with people in some way, and just even if it's a small group of people who get it, that feels like completing the circle in some way.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Go ahead.
Yeah.
I have a question. I have a lot of questions, and you answered them through that dialogue, so thank you. But one of them that's lingering is, what is your process for writing historical fiction? How do you balance the research and the writing? And do you get lost in it? I imagine over 20 years there were times when you weren't thinking about the novel, but are the characters and the history running in your mind all the time? And how do you kind of catch it and lasso it and bring it into your film?
My wife would tell you, yes, I am thinking about it all the time, but that's not true. I was actually thinking about dinner sometimes. So, the lassoing it was really all a matter of deciding who was going to tell the story and putting it in that character's voice, because otherwise I couldn't get my arms around, you know, Egypt. I couldn't get my arms around the Suez crisis. I couldn't get my arms around the war with Israel. I couldn't get my arms around that there were Israeli spies all over Egypt at that time. All I can get my arms around is like this guy who became a gas station owner in Brooklyn, thinking back on his youth and remembering how all those things had an effect on his life. Once that happened, then it was much clearer to me, well, this part of the story can't stay in. This part of the story has to stay in. in some way. I mean, I learned all kinds of funny details about, and interesting details about Egypt and about Hollywood, you know, that could make up another book, but that they just, you know, it was really finding the organizing principle to tell the story is what I was thinking about all the time.
And were there moments when you had to tell yourself, stop researching and start writing it, because you could just go off and never start reading it?
I like to say that research is a very sophisticated form of procrastination at a certain point. You know what I mean? Like it just, you can go on and on and on, and then you're disappearing up your own fundament at a certain point, and you just have to like take it out of your experience as the writer and put yourself in the position of the reader. Like, why would anybody care about this at this point? And sometimes it's that when you're talking about the book and your wife's eyes begin to glaze over, that's a good sign that it's time to stop doing the research.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Didn't you say that you met somebody that was like one of the characters? In real life, you met a guy that either had the same name or...
That happens to me with every single book I've written, that I will meet somebody who not only has some of the same biographical details as the character that I've written about after I've written the book, but in 5 cases, 2 of them specifically, I meet somebody who has the same first and last name as the character that I've already written.
Wow.
And that was not the case in this book. In this book, part of the secret history of the 10 Commandments that I don't think was very well known at all is that there's a reason why Nasser and the Egyptians cooperated with the making of the 10 Commandments on this scale. And I learned this from Cecil B. DeMille's grandchildren. It's that Cecil B. DeMille agreed to produce a documentary that would reintroduce Egypt to the world as a bastion of liberty now that the king was gone, and would make Nasser obviously look like a liberator and look very good. That movie was ultimately produced, and it was made, but it was never really shown. But I thought, the character of the documentary filmmaker, that seems like somebody out of a Graham Greene novel. That's really interesting. What's that guy's take on what's going on? And also he would find himself in all kinds of interesting moral situations. So he's a major character in the book. And in the book his name is Raymond Gorfine. And after I was done writing many versions of the book, I learned that there was a filmmaker named Jack Garfine. Some of you may have heard of him. He was very famous, but I just hadn't heard of him. He was one of the major figures in Actors Studio. And it just so happened when I began to focus on him, I was like, well, I've written this character with the same name. I've got to try and meet him. And it turned out that just coincidentally, he was staying 2 blocks from my house. So I went over to meet him. And as I talked to him, I discovered that, like the character in the book, he was originally a European Jew who lost people in the Holocaust and who was deeply scarred by the Holocaust. And I began to tell him, you know, that I've already written this character in this book, and it's not based on you, and I want you to know it's not based on you. He said, yeah, well, these things do happen. He was sort of nonchalant about it. And then we began to talk about his career and the fact that he only got to direct 2 films. They're very interesting films, by the way, that he got to direct. And I said, are you bitter about that? He said, well, let me tell you. When I was 11 years old, I found myself in Auschwitz. And I was in line with my mother and my sister. And they pushed me into another line, and I couldn't understand why. And that was the last time I saw my mother and my sister. And he said, I found myself at the front of the other line with a man I'd never seen before. And the German officer at the front of the line said, who are you, young man? And the older man who I was standing with said, I'm a master brick mason. This is my apprentice. I absolutely need him to do this work. And the German officer said, all right, go ahead in. And that's the only reason why I survived. He said, so you asked me, am I bitter that I only got to make 2 motion pictures? He said, I face tougher.
That's great.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions before we sign some books?
All right, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. And for braving the floods and COVID and, you know, all the other depredations of the day. So, and thank you very much, Michael, for having me here.
Thank you.
So
All
I'll
right.
just sit here. and
Yeah,
sign.
do you have a pen?
I have at least one.
Okay, come on up to get your book signed.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome, it's very interesting. This is for my girlfriend for Christmas.
She's a really neat lady.
Santa.
We're gonna be doing that on Monday
Why?
at 7. Do you do YouTube or? It's online, yeah, yeah. It's really the only movie she's written. But